Just imagine a man from the future who has been communicating with someone from the past. After talking, the man learns everything that will happen to him, but the danger of such interference with time can only be understood by experiencing it. The story begins in 1969, where we are introduced to a firefighter named Frank. Frank lived with his wife, Lydia, and their daughter, Joan. Frank's life was going very well. One night, the aurora lights appeared in the sky, which only occur once every few years. We then see a scene 30 years later, where Frank's son, John, has grown up significantly. However, John is very frustrated because his girlfriend wants to break up with him. We learn a crucial detail that John's grandfather, Frank, had passed away 30 years ago. Now, John lives with his mother, Julia. One day, a friend of John's visits his house, bringing his own son along. John and his friend were engaged in conversation, while his friend's son ventured into the storeroom and discovered an old-fashioned radio. When John found out, he went to see the radio and realized it was one his father had made years ago. Back then, radios required licenses to operate, but now these old radios had no value. John's friend, along with his son, eventually left. Driven by curiosity, John decided to turn on the radio and check it out, still nostalgic about his father. John sat alone, watching the news, where he saw that the aurora lights were visible in the sky again, just as they had been 30 years ago. Suddenly, John began to hear some sounds coming from the radio. When he turned it on, he heard a man's voice from the other side. This man was talking about a baseball match that took place in 1969. John remarked that the match had concluded 30 years ago. John also told the other man that Barcelona's team would win the baseball game, but the man did not believe it could happen. We then see the other man's TV, which was quite old. At that moment, the man's son arrived, and the other man referred to his child as Little Champ, which shocked John greatly because his own father used to call him by the same name. John immediately asked the other man for his name, and the man introduced himself as Frank. John was astounded to learn that his father's name was also Frank. The other man was indeed John's father, but the strange thing was that John was communicating with his father from 1969 using a time travel device. Although John had passed away in 1999, he was still alive in this alternate timeline. John had understood all of this, but his father, Frank, who was present, couldn't grasp what was happening. Meanwhile, Frank was smoking a cigarette and inadvertently causing a fire, which directly affected John's timeline as well. John's house in his timeline was also slightly damaged due to the fire. John told his father that he would die the next day while performing his duties as a firefighter. He mentioned that Frank would die in a fire at a burning building. John also told his father that if he had taken a different path, he would have been safe. Frank began to suspect that someone was either playing a prank on him or that a detective was keeping an eye on him. Terrified, Frank decided to leave the situation to John. When Frank arrived at his office and watched the news, he found out that Barcelona's team had indeed lost, just as John had predicted. Everything John had said about the match had turned out to be true, which deeply shocked Frank. Now, Frank, along with his firefighting team, went to a location to extinguish a fire. There were still some people trapped inside a burning building, and Frank entered to rescue a child. This was the very place where Frank was destined to die. Suddenly, Frank recalled John's words about taking an alternate route to save his life. To prevent Frank's death, he takes an alternate route out of the burning building, ensuring that he survives. He returns safely, and in 1999, John is having fun with his friends when he suddenly starts experiencing strange memories related to his mother. In these memories, John imagines that his father was never killed. After calming down, John asks his friends if his father really died while firefighting. His friends inform him that nothing of the sort happened. Instead, his father died of lung cancer. John is confused, as the situation is simpler than it seems. Since Frank didn't die in 1969, the entire present timeline has changed, meaning Frank is still alive in the present as well. John even notices his father's photo in the family pictures. In 1969, Frank realizes that John is actually his son communicating from the future. Both come to understand this profound truth. John is incredibly happy to hear his father's voice after such a long time. John advises his father to quit smoking, warning that otherwise, he will die of lung cancer in the future. Frank understands John's advice well, so he decides to reduce smoking. John then focuses on a case involving the Nightingale, a serial killer who has been active for years, targeting and killing women. Victims of the Nightingale are being discovered, but John believes that only 3 women had been killed. However, it is revealed that the Nightingale has actually committed 10 murders. Distressed, John reviews all the files and discovers that among the victims, his own mother was included. Confused and alarmed, John rushes home to confirm this, only to find that his mother is missing and not in the family photos. This means that his mother had died years ago. John decides to contact his father again via the radio to seek more information. John told Frank that due to tampering with the timeline, his mother might have died. Such incidents were bound to occur because John had saved his father by communicating with him, which had altered the entire past timeline. John felt incredibly guilty because his mistake had caused his mother's death. He advised his father, Frank, to somehow find the killer to bring his mother back. According to the documents, his mother's death was recorded as October 22nd. The good news was that this date was still a week away in his father's timeline, meaning Frank in 1969 still had time to find the killer and save John's mother. John guided his father on how to catch the killer, providing him with all the documents he had, which revealed the killer's next target. In the past, Frank had gone to a diner where the Nightingale was about to murder a nurse. However, by talking to several women at the diner, Frank managed to distract the dangerous killer, preventing him from killing the nurse. In the present time, the document about the woman was missing, indicating that the Nightingale's attack had been thwarted. John continued guiding his father to find the killer, but when Frank arrived at a location where his son John was supposed to be, the Nightingale became suspicious of Frank. Consequently, when Frank went to the restroom, the Nightingale followed him and began to attack him. The Nightingale had stolen many items from Frank's wallet before leaving. Due to these stolen items, Frank was unable to prevent the next murder of a woman. When Frank reported these events to his future son John, John asked if the wallet was still with him. If the Nightingale had touched the wallet, his fingerprints would be on it. John instructed Frank to place the wallet in a plastic bag and hide it in a very secure location. As soon as Frank made these changes, they affected the timeline 30 years later as well. Now, the wallet that Frank had hidden in the wooden compartment was retrieved. The department captured the fingerprints from the wallet, which belonged to the Nightingale. After considerable research, John discovered the identity of the Nightingale. The Nightingale's real name was Jack, who used to be a police officer. However, after 30 years, Jack had become very elusive, so John went directly to Jack. Although John didn't want to reveal that he knew Jack was the Nightingale, he indirectly told Jack that he was searching for a criminal named Nightingale and wanted to capture him as soon as possible. John then used the radio to inform his father about Jack. However, in the 1969 timeline, the police arrived at Frank's location because they had found Frank's license details during the last murder. Since there was no concrete evidence, the police wanted to arrest him. Frank then told the police officers the whole truth, explaining that he had a device that allowed him to communicate with his future son. His son had informed him about all the events happening over the next 30 years, which helped them identify the Nightingale. Frank revealed that the Nightingale was actually an individual named Jack Effort. The police officer thought Frank's story was a joke and, consequently, imprisoned him. Jack, who was actually the Nightingale, realized that Frank knew too much about him and wanted to kill Frank quickly. When Frank was about to be executed, another officer arrived, which allowed Frank to escape from jail. Frank then went straight to Jack's house because his future son John had told him that Jack kept a piece of jewelry from each woman he killed. If they could obtain this evidence, they could present it in court to prove that Jack was the murderer. As Frank was retrieving all the evidence, Jack came into the room and started shooting at him. Frank tried desperately to escape and ended up fighting Jack, eventually falling into the water. After a fierce struggle, Frank managed to strangle Jack to death. Without thinking twice, Frank escaped from the water. Surprisingly, the police never found Jack's body in the water. Back at his home, Frank started talking to his future son. However, John informed his father that if Jack was dead, his mother should also be alive, but her photo was still missing from the family picture. Both of them were confused by this situation. Meanwhile, in 1969, Jack's older self attacked John in 1999. Jack was attacking both John and his father across the timelines, leaving them bewildered. In a fit of anger, Frank from 1969 struck Jack's hand with a gun. Consequently, in 1999, Jack's hand was automatically cut off because Frank had shot him. Jack continued to attack John, but the older Frank, who had become very wise, arrived and shot Jack. Since Jack's death altered the entire timeline, John's grandfather and mother were now alive. John never used the radio again because everything in his life had returned to normal. He married his ex-girlfriend and had a son, living happily with his parents. And so, our story ends here.